Today, we are diving into a really fascinating modern intellectual framework for interpreting the Quran. It's called BioIslam, and it's all about trying to bridge the gap between ancient faith and our modern scientific age.
And really, it all kicks off with this massive question, one that a lot of ancient traditions are grappling with. How can a text from the 7th century possibly give us guidance for the incredibly complex problems we're facing today in the 21st century? That's the core challenge we're going to unpack.
So here's our roadmap. First, we'll tackle what's called the ancient text problem. Then, we'll look at a dual-access debate to see the intellectual battlefield. After that, we'll get into a radical departure from tradition, introduce the concept of BioIslam itself, and finally, see how it aims to solve what the source calls the Big Five problems.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the ancient text problem. This is all about relevance, you know? The source material we're looking at puts this central conflict front and center. What do you do when a sacred verse, one that's been understood a certain way for centuries, suddenly seems to clash with new scientific discoveries? It's a huge dilemma, and it really sets the stage for everything else. So, that brings us to our next section. To really get a handle on this, the source lays out what it calls the dual-axis debate. Think of it like a map for understanding the different camps in this interpretive battle. And this debate plays out along two key lines. The first is about the text itself. Should we read it literally, word for word, or is it more figurative, like a metaphor? The second is about how we apply it. Is the guidance timeless, meaning it's the same for every era, or is it temporal, meaning it was specific to the time it was revealed? And this is where it gets really clear. The source shows us two opposing biases. On one side, you have the traditionalist view, which tends to lean toward literal and timeless interpretations. On the other side, you have the BioIslam view, which favors interpretations that are more figurative and temporal, allowing the meaning to adapt as our knowledge grows. So, how does that traditionalist view get built and passed down? Well, a huge part of it is the consensus of the ummah, and that's a key term we need to define. The ulama, pronounced ulama, are the recognized community of Islamic scholars. You can think of them as the guardians of religious and legal tradition for centuries. Their collective agreement is what really forms the foundation of the traditionalist approach. Now, this whole practice of deferring to the judgments and interpretations of past generations of scholars, it has a name, and it's absolutely central to this discussion. It's called taqlid. Taqlid, or taqlid, is defined here as the pious and deferential acceptance of the rulings of prior scholars, without independent investigation. So it's a method built on deep respect for tradition. But as you can probably guess, it's also the very thing the BioIslam framework wants to challenge. And that challenge is what brings us to part 3, the radical departure. This is where BioIslam makes its biggest and most controversial break, by questioning the entire hierarchy of who gets to say what a text means. So according to the source, the traditional stance is that you can't really understand the Quran on its own. You absolutely must use these later post-Quranic texts, things like the Sirah, the biographies of the Prophet, and the Hadith, his sayings. They're seen as essential for getting the historical context for each and every verse. And the source material does not mince words on this point. It states, plain and simple, this is our radical point of departure from traditionalists. It's a bold declaration that signals a deep, fundamental split in how to approach the text. So what's the bottom line here? The BioIslam framework completely rejects the idea that these fallible, human-written books from centuries later should get to supervise the interpretation of the Quran. The argument is that this reliance creates something the source calls cumulative fallibilism. It's like a chain reaction, where small human errors from one generation get passed down and then built upon by the next through this practice of taqlid. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on what BioIslam rejects. Now, in section 4, let's finally define what it is. The source calls it a pro-science theohumanism, a way of thinking built for our world today. At its core, BioIslam is defined as scientific Islam. Simple as that. It's a framework that, like we saw, prefers figurative and temporal readings of the Quran, and it uses modern science and reason as its main tools for navigation. Now, you might hear figurative interpretation and think this sounds like a mystical tradition, something like Sufism. But the source is really careful to draw a distinction. BioIslam isn't presented as some mystical journey. It's framed as a practical, pro-science, problem-solving philosophy, what the author calls a theohumanism.
And here are its guiding principles. It tries to blend scientific thinking with a kind of modern spirituality. The main goal is to pull out what it calls Quranic latent principles that can actually help us today. It even has this, daring transhuman dream of ending physical suffering. And it's really important to add, this isn't just some casual idea. The source material presents this as a serious, scholarly project, backed up with a ton of research, which you can see in all the footnotes. And this brings us to our final section, the practical mission. Because BioIslam isn't just an abstract theory. It's designed to solve what it identifies as the big 5 problems that plague many societies.
Yeah, and this is really the key takeaway. According to the source, the whole point of this framework is to get beyond endless theological debates and actually offer real, tangible solutions to some of the toughest challenges we face. So what are they? Here are the big 5 problems BioIslam wants to solve. Poverty, brain drain, which is when talented people leave their home countries. Authoritarianism, which the source links to the kind of rigid thinking found in Taqlid. Patriarchy, which it says holds back half the population. And finally, the politicization of religion, which so often leads to division and conflict. But even with this incredibly ambitious mission, the source ends on a note of real intellectual humility. It makes a point to say that, hey, we're all just human here. Both sides of this debate are fallible. It's not about finding one perfect answer because, as it says, this grand dual-axis debate will never be fully resolved. And that leaves us with one final big question that gets to the heart of this whole thing. If we agree that interpretation has to evolve with science, then where do you draw the line? How do you separate a timeless, universal principle from a context that's just outdated? That's the challenge this framework puts on the table, and it's a question worth thinking about long after we're done here.